After 3 months of devastation, displacement, and the killing of Palestinians, we're taking a deep dive into the way the story of Gaza has been covered. A journalist, an expert on human rights, and another on digital rights, on what has taken place, the humanitarian catastrophe, and the way the media, through their news coverage, have helped pave the way to a genocide. Since the attacks on October 7th, the Listening Post has interviewed a range of experts on the news coverage, what's missing in it, and how it has helped enable the crimes being waged on Palestinians in Gaza. In this special edition, we have compiled 3 interviews, starting with Israel has said that its goal in Gaza is to destroy Hamas, but its attacks on Palestinians have also escalated on the West Bank, where Hamas has no authority or military presence. That violence is usually provoked by Israeli settlers. Prior to October 7th, almost 200 Palestinians had been killed on the West Bank in the previous 10 months. That number has more than doubled since. Mariam Barghouti is a Palestinian journalist based in Ramallah on the West Bank. She's been interviewed by multiple media outlets, and some of those exchanges, like this one with the UK channel Sky News, have been heated.
Dozens of Palestinians are killed. We call it a slaughter. We have called it a massacre this time because it's that. Yeah, no, I'm talking about individuals. But could you just answer? I'm just interested.
For the last 20 years.
Yeah.
If you would like to talk to me as a journalist, at least come with me with the right information, please.
I began by asking Mariam Barghouti about what she's seen in the Western media's coverage of this story.
The way international journalists attempt to trope Palestinians and delegitimize, as well as deny the crimes against them, has not only become vicious in the way that journalists are framing it, like that interview, but it has increased and become lethal in a way that it is a complete pro-genocidal stance by journalists that claim to be objective, that claim to be nonpartisan, that claim to be supporting the truth, to support accuracy for their audiences. But it's not just common. It is being encouraged by editors and policymakers, whether directly or indirectly.
So you don't see that as someone not fully understanding the context and bringing the context to the interview. You see that more as an intention.
Absolutely. As journalists, it is our job to do our due diligence. So to claim ignorance requires you to quit your job and go and learn.
Since October 7th, journalists from around the world have flown into the region. A lot of them are still based in Israel. Some of them have embedded with the Israeli military to get into Gaza. How difficult is it for journalists to get into the West Bank? And for those who haven't been to the West Bank to cover the story, what are they missing?
It's relatively difficult for journalists to enter the West Bank only in comparison to previous times. But Israel is placing restrictions and is assigning things like minders to different bureau chiefs and international reporters in the region. And that is someone that responds and operates under the command of the Israeli military to attempt and coerce, manipulate, as well as pressure journalists to cover in a certain angle or to deny information from audiences. But nonetheless, journalists still have the capacity to challenge this and come into the West Bank. The persons that they are bringing on to speak on the situation are the very people that are committing the crimes against Palestinians. That is Israeli military spokespersons, that is Israeli policymakers and settlers. And at the same time, negating the Palestinian testimony. And if they do speak with Palestinians, it is always an attempt to frame a two-sidism. But there is no two sides to this, not just because it's a false equivalence between colonizer and colonized, but because journalists are only showing one side, and that is the Israeli side. And unfortunately, what we have seen more than that is a negation and a denial of the information and news that local journalists have, as though that is inferior, rather than recognizing that local journalists are the experts on this situation, even though their lives are at increased risk from Israeli repression, as we have seen in their targeting in Gaza.
Many Western and international media outlets simply brand this as a war between Israel and Hamas. How accurate is that framing, given everything that we've been hearing from Israeli officials on the record targeting civilians in Gaza? How accurate is the framing? How dangerous is it?
It is so dangerous to take what is happening to Palestinians and reduce it to the title of an Hamas-Israel war. This is not a war between Hamas and Israel. This is a war against Palestinians in all geographical locations within Palestine as well as outside of Palestine, reminding that 50% of the population is in forced exile or are refugees abroad. So to frame it as that is a reductionist approach, and it is an attempt to continue the illustration of Palestinians as terrorists because of the association that was made of what Hamas is. We see the Israeli military, they closed down a printing shop downtown Ramallah just this morning, and the flyer on the door that they plastered was Hamas equals ISIS. So it goes to show you how manipulative that narrative is. And then there is no mention of Gaza being besieged for close to 2 decades. There is no mention of the same thing happening in Gaza right now has happened before at a smaller scale, because what we have seen is transcending all trends of violence that we Palestinians have witnessed, or we have witnessed in the region since 1948. So to claim that it is a Hamas and Israel war is either an inability to actually do the due diligence and look into the context and explain that to your audience, or it is intentional, and that means you are being complicit in genocide.
One last question for you. We've seen some amazing journalism coming out of Gaza, Palestinians, too many of whom have paid with their lives, making a name for themselves, getting the recognition that they deserve. Can you give us a few names of some good follows of Palestinian journalists on the West Bank, people whose work is worthy of our following?
It's so difficult to speak about journalists here.
Tell me about it.
Considering just the targeting.
Yeah.
It's heartache. And as a reporter, I think we forget that these are our peers. And it also, we're not advocating just for the protection of journalists, but as reporters and journalists, we're advocating for ourselves to remain safe. But in terms of coverage, I think there are multiple reporters and news organizations that are actually going against the grain and going against the restrictions that are being imposed by editorial policies abroad, at least. Al Jazeera has been doing incredible coverage of what's been happening all across Palestine, not just Gaza and the West Bank, but in its entire context. There are organizations such as Mondoweiss, which has also been reporting excellent in print on the West Bank. We have Middle East Eye that has also been showcasing excellent reporting on the West Bank, as well as highlighting and covering the disinformation and mistranslation that has been happening within international media organizations. But in terms of individuals, you can see the works of people like Fatin Alwan. You can see the works of Muhammad al-Kurd, although he is not here, but he is able to amplify a lot of the coverage that is being sent from local journalists abroad. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have maybe too specific names.
That's fine. That's fine. Mariam Barghouti, thank you for joining us today here at the Listening Post.
Thank you for having me.
You've been watching a special edition of our program, a compilation of our most informative and at times heartfelt interviews on Israel's genocidal assault on the Gaza Strip. We'll stay on this story to see where it goes from here and how it's reported. And we'll see you next time